First, good evening. My name's John Highbush. I have the honor of being the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, and I just want to thank everyone here for taking the time to come out. In honor of our men and women in uniform who defend our freedom around the world, if you please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks. Please be seated. Before we get started tonight, there's a few people in the audience I'd like to recognize, two in particular. They're Simi Valley Council members, Mike Judge and Keith Mashburn. Gentlemen, thanks for coming. Well, it was just a few months ago that my office got a call from our friends at HarperCollins Publishing, and they had a question. They wanted to know whether or not the Reagan Library would be happy to host Governor Sununu for a visit with his new book. The answer I gave was immediate, emphatic, and enthusiastic. Yes, I said. Why yes? Yes, absolutely yes. And I remember some of my staff looked at me at the time and they wondered, well, why all the exuberance? After all, at the moment, I didn't even know what the book was about. And frankly, I didn't care. You see, as one of a few thousand political appointees of President George H.W. Bush, I'd had the honor of working very indirectly for Governor Sununu when he was our 41st President's Chief of Staff. And no doubt, I think I was trained well on the job. Although it's been 26 years, I feel like it was only yesterday. And rather than HarperCollins Publishing calling me, to me it was just as though President Bush's Chief of Staff himself was on the line. And I think I literally dove for the phone. I learned early on that where Governor Sununu was involved, it would be wiser to burn in hell than to let him down. So, Governor, welcome to the Reagan Library. But in all seriousness, we are really thrilled to have you here. We're also thrilled to see that you have written a book about, Nancy Reagan aside, the most reliable and important wingman President Reagan ever had. It would be impossible to take a measure of the Reagan presidency and the Reagan legacy without a companion study of President Bush. I know that you once made a promise to President Bush that you would never write an insider's account of his time at the White House. But it is a great thing that both of you changed your minds on that, because there was truly a need for one. You have succeeded, I know, in writing the single most authoritative book ever produced on the subject of President Bush 41, and for that we are really in your debt. We're also in your debt for something else as well. As you've so faithfully recounted, the Bush presidency was marked by both great and quiet accomplishments, only now being recognized as the landmark events they were. I think it is safe to say that all of them, foreign and domestic, were made possible in part because of your strong leadership as the President's Chief of Staff. You are, I know, no doubt, familiar with the small placard that graced President Reagan's desk in the Oval Office. And for those of you who are not, I have it here, and it reads, "There's no limit to what a man can do or where he can go if he doesn't mind who gets the credit." President Bush, the modest, quiet man that he is, lives by those words every day. I know that. The record is also clear, Governor Sununu, that as a first-rate public servant, so do you. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would, please join me in welcoming Governor John Sununu.
Thank you, John. Very nice. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I really want to thank all of you, first of all, for coming out on an evening like this. These are summer evenings, and they're precious to everybody who's got a family, so I thank you for coming here. I'd also like to thank John and his colleagues here at the library for inviting me to come and giving me this opportunity to talk a little bit about my book. The best part about talking about my book is I get to talk about a president that I really respected. And I'll spend a little time tonight telling you why I think he had probably the finest and most effective and most productive one-term presidency this country has ever had. I'd also like to point out to you that this facility we're in is one of a whole series of presidential libraries that are, in my opinion, a set of the great treasures in this country for anybody who cares about how this country functions, how presidents do the kinds of things that we want our presidents to do, and repositories not only of what that particular president has done, but how our presidencies fit together. And I know you're very familiar with this one, but if you ever get a chance to visit some of the others, I really encourage you to do it. I can't tell you how valuable the George Herbert Walker Bush Library at Texas A&M was. As I tried to get the things I talked about in my book, I tried to get them correctly, and with an amazing staff down there, they were able to find every little arcane piece of information that I asked them to do. I'm here to talk about a book that I've titled The Quiet Man. I picked that title from a line that George Bush used in his 1988 acceptance speech. In that speech, he said, "I am a quiet man, but I hear the quiet people that others don't." And I have to tell you, retrospectively, that line really described George Bush to a T. To a great extent, one of his biggest faults was that he really hated to talk about himself. He really avoided doing any kind of telling people what he had accomplished. It all came from a line from his mother. She told him, "George, don't brag and bend your knees when you volley." And in that line, there are really two dictates that really George Bush followed throughout his life. He was a quiet man. He didn't brag. He didn't talk about what he accomplished. He just went out and did it. And he looked at many things in life as a mission. That's a phrase he quite often used himself, a phrase that came from the days when he was the youngest pilot in the Navy flying 58 combat missions. But the second part of that also is a message that he took to heart. Bend your knees when you volley. What she was saying when she told him that was, "George, when you're going to do something, there's a right way to do it. Do it the right way." And that's an admonition that really defined the George Bush I knew extremely well. He tried to make things work. He tried to get results. And I think the combination of getting results and doing it quietly puts him in a category that I thought I needed as a former chief of staff to put between a pair of covers a book that would define what I felt were his amazing accomplishments as President of the United States. Now, we are here at the Reagan Library, and I think it's important for me to set a context for George Bush coming into the presidency. He came into a presidency after Ronald Reagan had turned this country around. Ronald Reagan had rebuilt our defense structure. He had cut the upper level of taxes from 70% to 28%. He had led the world in a response to an aggressive Soviet Union. And we remember the famous speech he gave where he told Gorbachev to tear down this wall. That was the climate of the country, the change in the country over the 8 years of the Reagan presidency that George Bush inherited when he got elected president in 1988 and took the oath of office in January of 1989. Things weren't settled, but Ronald Reagan had laid a great foundation. Now, if I asked anybody in this room what they remembered about George Bush, 9 chances out of 10 or 99 out of 100 maybe, you would all tell me a little bit about his fantastic accomplishments in foreign policy. George Bush is remembered the most as being a foreign policy president. But in fact, George Bush was one of the most prolific and successful domestic policy presidents. And one of the reasons I did write the book was to make sure that people remembered that in terms of the historical perspective on this presidency. George Bush passed more domestic legislation, proposed, really dictated the crafting of, and passed more domestic legislation than any president except Lyndon Johnson or Franklin Roosevelt. And I'll get to it. They're great pieces of legislation that we today are still benefiting from the important aspects of those pieces of law that he put together and got passed. I had the great pleasure and the great honor to be Chief of Staff for the President and Counselor to the President for 3¼ years, from January of 1989 to March of 1992. And I can tell you, people often ask me, wasn't that a hard job? Wasn't it a difficult job? And I think I shock them when I tell them that I had more fun at that job than anything else I've ever done. And in an odd way, it was the easiest job I ever had, because the resources we had to do what had to be done were virtually infinite. And if you had a president that was willing to give direction, which I had, and a president that understood that things had to get done and allowed you to go out and make sure that the pieces were put together properly, I could actually go home at night with a cleaner desk from that job than any other job I've ever had, because there was a president there that understood that he wasn't there to delay decisions. He was there to make decisions. And we got direction quite clearly from this president. Let me talk a little bit about some of the specific things I touch on in the book. Start a little bit with foreign policy. George Bush came into office after Ronald Reagan had held 4 summits with Mikhail Gorbachev. And Ronald Reagan had invested in rebuilding America's defensive strength. You remember the president's phrase, peace through strength. Peace through strength was not only a good political slogan, it in fact was a defining slogan for the U.S. positioning itself in the world in order to maintain stability, create a peaceful structure, and to deal with what had become a very rambunctious Soviet Union over the preceding years before Reagan came into office. But Ronald Reagan dedicated the economic strength of this country to rebuilding our national security capacity. So George Bush comes into office. He sees a Gorbachev who now understands that the United States is not going to back down from its commitment to being a strong superpower. And George Bush recognizes that there is an opportunity to make a major change in the relationships that existed after World War II until that time. But he also understood how complicated that process would be. He saw in Gorbachev an inclination to allow change to happen in Europe. But he also knew that Gorbachev had behind him in the Soviet Union the hardliners who were just waiting for an excuse to turn on Gorbachev because they did not like this direction of perhaps a better relationship with the U.S., and they certainly did not like the idea of having to change the occupation role that they had in Eastern Europe. But George Bush came in, and understood that this might be a moment in history that could not be replicated. And so what he did is he laid on the table an offer to Gorbachev to reduce the troops and armor the U.S. had through NATO in Europe. He, in essence, told Gorbachev that we would back out of Europe if Gorbachev made equivalent reductions of the military capacity they had in Eastern Europe. In order to succeed with such a strategy, George Bush had to deal with a couple of certain kinds of protocols and needs. He certainly had to put the offer on the table with Gorbachev in such a way that Gorbachev would be receptive to the offer. But even more complicated, he had to deal with Margaret Thatcher, Francois Mitterrand, and Helmut Kohl and the other leaders in Europe, all of whom still thought that they should be making the decisions on what happened there and not following the U.S.'s lead. That's the art. What George Bush was able to do is the art of being a president that knows how to lead. First of all, he spent some time with Francois Mitterrand, and Francois Mitterrand had gotten into a personality conflict, as the French often do, with Ronald Reagan. George Bush invited him to Walker's Point. I have to tell you, when he did that, Scowcroft and I kind of looked at each other and wondered whether he had lost his marbles. Francois Mitterrand was the classic European, and George Bush was the most informal man you've ever seen in general, but at Walker's Point he was extremely informal. And when Mitterrand got off the helicopter dressed to the nines, being greeted by the President and Mrs. Bush not quite dressed to the nines, we thought it was going to be a difficult weekend. But George Bush did what George Bush does best. He deferred to Mitterrand because Mitterrand had been in office longer than he had. And he asked him what he wanted to do in Europe. And he spent time listening to Mitterrand's long historic discourses of the history of Germany and the history of France, and understood that here was a man that really cared about getting results, but he wanted to be part of the decision process. And George Bush made him feel that way. And when Mitterrand left after 2 days there, he was 100% in concert with George Bush's proposal to do something big, bold, and dramatic. Then the president had to deal with Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher had been a great friend with Ronald Reagan. She had called Ronald Reagan the second most important man in her life. And he knew she was apprehensive about how she was going to deal with the new president. But once again, this time with a series of personal phone calls to Mrs. Thatcher, not necessarily asking her for anything, but just communicating to her what his broad ideas were, and again asking her for her opinion. He won her over. And then he did the same kind of thing with Kohl. So when George Bush went to Europe and put this dramatic proposal on the table, he now had unified the NATO heads of state and put on the table something in a way that he felt Gorbachev could accept. And Gorbachev took that and began to ease the iron control that he had over Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania and Hungary and so on. It obviously isn't the end of getting results, but it was a good beginning. Let me give you one anecdote which I think defines how amazingly interesting and what a wonderful insight George Bush had into trying to deal with these world issues. Right after we had laid these proposals down, Gorbachev had indicated to the Poles in particular that he would allow them to hold elections. And Walesa and his reformers worked hard And all of a sudden, Poland has free elections for the first time in decades. And Wałęsa and the reformers win every legislative seat but one, while the president and the executive side is still in control of the communists. This happens 1 week before we're supposed to go and visit in Poland. And so we all asked George Bush, how are we going to deal with this divided government? And the president invites ambassadors and ex-ambassadors to come in and give him some insight. He invites academics and members of Congress, and this goes on for 5 or 6 days. And we still have no indication from him as to what he wants to do. We're about to get on the plane, Air Force One, to go over to Poland, and the president says, have the ambassador host a lunch. And again, Scowcroft and I kind of look at each other. And this is the grand plan? Have the ambassador host a lunch? We land in Poland. We first go and meet with Wałęsa. Crowd of 300,000 listen to the president speak. We then go and meet with Jaruzelski, who is the communist president of Poland. And somehow George Bush gets a feeling that maybe this guy is not so bad. But he doesn't say anything to us. And we go on that afternoon. We go to this lunch hosted by the ambassador. It's about 10 or 12 tables set up. About at each of the table, the president and I and Scowcroft and other members, key members of the administration, kind of serving as a table host, one at each table. And I'm sitting at a table, and on my right is the Minister of Interior, Communist Minister of Interior. And about 3 minutes into the lunch, one of the reformers across the table stands up and shakes his finger in the face of this minister and says, I don't know if you remember me, but you put me in prison. And the minister looked up, kind of paused for a moment, and said, yes, but remember, I gave you a good cell. And I look around the room, and all of a sudden, you see that these kinds of conversations are taking place. And both sides are discovering that yeah, one group is reformers, the other group is the communists, but they're Poles first. They care about Poland. And they start talking about what they can and can't do. And the last memory I have of that lunch is in the corners, Wałęsa and the reformers with Jaruzelski and his people, and they're beginning to talk about how they're going to create a coalition government. And 4 weeks later, there's an election for the presidency, and Jaruzelski wins the presidency again with Wałęsa's support. And Poland goes through an extremely peaceful transition. All because George Bush said, have the ambassador host a lunch. 2 other quick anecdotes about our European trips that'll give you some idea the kind of person George Bush is. We landed in Hungary in the middle of a rainstorm. We go to the square, about 70,000 people in the square. The president's walking up to speak, and there's this older woman there, and even though it's a hot, rainy day, it was a summer day, she's shivering in the rain. And George Bush takes off his raincoat, and he gives it to her. And the 70,000 people just burst into applause. And George Bush could have done anything in Hungary that he wanted after that. In Czechoslovakia we go, and Wenceslas Square is a much bigger square than the one in Hungary. It's about 700,000 people in the square. And when George Bush delivers the line, "Czechoslovakia shall be free," it was like an express train, a freight train, roaring through the square. The roar was unbelievable. It made the building shake. And what he did was set with that line, made the Czechoslovakian people understand that this time, if they supported change, it would not be the same as happened to them in 1956. Just a series of things like that by a president who understood how to fit all the pieces together. One last thing on this European reunification. Actually, two things. One, George Bush realized, as this process started, how important and valuable it would be for Europe and the world if he could accelerate the unification of Germany. Remember, we had East Germany and West Germany. East Germany occupied by the communists, by the Soviets. West Germany, a Western free democracy. Certainly Mitterrand and Mrs. Thatcher were not happy with that idea. Their countries had been savaged by the Germans twice in the last 50 years, and the 50 years before that. But George Bush, over a period of time, talking to them, working with them, trying to deal with their concerns, finally convinced them that it would be the best thing for Europe and best thing for the world. And Germany was unified, came together within a year. The last thing that I want to say on this issue about George Bush was his personal discipline and understanding how difficult the process was for Mikhail Gorbachev. Ronald Reagan had told Mikhail Gorbachev, "Tear down this wall." The wall was still there. In November of 1989, right after the Polish elections, right after Gorbachev had withdrawn some of the Soviet troops from Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania, right after he had indicated that changes would be permitted, Gorbachev said that he would allow travel from the Eastern European countries back and forth. Nobody knew whether that included Germany, but the Germans decided to test it and started coming through and literally passing right by the Russian and East German guards that in the past would have killed them if they tried to do it. The Berlin Wall came down that way. But back in the States, this is happening in an evening in Germany. We're in the Oval Office, the afternoon, 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours difference. And the press secretary comes in and says, "We have to do something. We have to communicate to the press, as this is going on." So we arrange for a meeting of the press to come in and give questions to the president. Well, George Bush knew the hardliners were waiting to take on Gorbachev. And I don't know if you remember the headlines that came out of that meeting, but the press was trying to suggest that George Bush didn't understand how important an event this was because he wasn't standing on the desk and cheering. Yet if you read Mikhail Gorbachev's memoirs, Gorbachev says how important it was that George Bush merely said it was a good thing and we hope more things like this can happen. He showed discipline enough that allowed Gorbachev to withstand the criticism of his hardliners. There was another major foreign policy issue, the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein. George Bush didn't hesitate. He said very clearly, "This aggression shall not stand." And when he drew a line in the sand, he stuck with it. They invaded in August. We started building up our troops and sending our troops over. We got messages from our Defense Department and our military what was required. George Bush was approving it all. One day, however, Colin Powell comes in, calls me on the phone, says, "Governor, I have to see the president right away." I arrange for the meeting. We're in the office, and Powell comes in, and there's none of the usual banter that takes place with a meeting with George Bush. Powell comes in serious, very serious, says, "Mr. President, I have to let you know, I know you're about to make certain decisions on this. I have to let you know that we need much more in terms of manpower and equipment than we've been talking about." And he proceeds to virtually double the size of request: 250,000 troops, another 3,000 tanks, another 2,000 airplanes, more naval power, and goes through this presentation. And certainly it's Powell's duty to let the president know exactly what's required. And I watched George Bush, and he listened carefully. And when Powell finished, without a hesitation, Bush looked at him and said, "General Powell, if that's what you need to get the job right, you have it. And if you need anything else to do it right, you come back and tell me." That doesn't sound like a very significant response. But in fact, in my opinion, it was one of the most important decisions the president as commander-in-chief ever made since Vietnam. Because during Vietnam, when the military came into Lyndon Johnson and asked for something, Lyndon always thought they were asking for too much and gave him 80% or 70%. And whether he understood it or not, he was creating a psychology which stimulated an excuse for failure. What George Bush did was define a doctrine that said we will use everything we need in order to do a job right. And General Powell, you have no excuse for failure. And it made all the difference in the world. Now, I mentioned that domestic policy was one of the president's great achievements. It turns out that one of his most important achievements domestically was the one he was criticized the most for, and that was the budget agreement of 1990. George Bush had said at the convention when he accepted the nomination, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Now we had passed a one-year budget without any taxes. We negotiated with a Congress controlled by the Democrats. In the House, Foley controlled it with 260 Democrats to 175 Republicans. In the Senate, Mitchell controlled it 55 to 45. And now the economy was slowing down. The S&L crisis had taken its toll on real estate. The financial markets were really clamoring for a multi-year budget. There was a slowing down of the economy across the board. We needed a 5-year budget. And the president had just sent men and women over to the Middle East to take on Saddam Hussein. The last thing he could tolerate as commander-in-chief was a sequester on the defense budget. So we negotiated and negotiated and negotiated. It was clear that we were not going to get a budget without George Bush accepting some taxes. And so he basically said, "Go and get everything we can get if we have to pay this price." So we got new budgeting rules which put a cap on spending growth. We got pay-as-you-go, which required all new programs to have a program to earn the costs built into them. We got 3.5 times the size of the taxes that he would accept in budget cuts, so that we cut the spending dramatically. And the tax that he did accept was an increase in the gasoline tax, which hadn't had an inflationary adjustment in almost a decade. He got criticized for it, but what did that budget do? It revitalized the economy. It created the surpluses in the middle of the 1990s that Bill Clinton loves to take credit for. But with the cap on spending and the cutting of the spending at the time and the new budgeting rules, they were able to get a surplus. And most of all, it created the growth of the 1990s, which created a huge increase of jobs and job availability in this country. So George Bush took the political penalty, but gave the country the benefit that came out of that budget. Same thing happened with clean air and child care. He proposed and got a good civil rights bill. He got an Americans with Disabilities Act. He got legislation which deregulated our energy industry, which we now are benefiting from dramatically. He did agricultural reform, which replaced some of the subsidies with incentives for exports, and now we are the leading agricultural exporter in the world. He had a crime bill which began to address the problems that the cities were having at that time in crime. He dealt with immigration with a piece of legislation that put the emphasis on bringing in talented people into this country as immigrants and allowing for the proper reunification of families. All of these things on the domestic side. He also put together the Brady Plan, which revitalized the Western Hemisphere economies and brought a climate of democracy back to this hemisphere. So by the time George Bush left office, in every South and Latin American country except Cuba, there was a democratically elected president. He negotiated the NAFTA bill that eventually Clinton signed. So George Bush, in his 4 years, was as productive as you could possibly be. So the question comes up, how come he didn't win re-election? I explain it by what I call the Churchill Effect. There's a lot of gray hair in this room, so some of you will remember that in World War II, Winston Churchill, by dint of his personality and his leadership and his emotional commitment to England, led that country in response to what the Nazis were doing in Europe. And it was Winston Churchill that was the leader that created the victory for England and its allies over the Nazis. And what happened? Even before the war was over, there was an election in England and Churchill lost. Now fast forward to Bush. After the fall of the Soviet Union, after he kicked Saddam out of Kuwait, we in this country look and we exhale and say it's time to look at a president that will look inward. Bush lost. Mrs. Thatcher was kicked out of her leadership role with her party. Mitterrand lost. Kohl lost. The Australian Prime Minister lost. Mulroney lost. The Japanese Prime Minister lost, and his ruling party was kicked out for the first time since World War II. This wave, if you will, of we no longer have to worry about international security caused people to vote for parties that they thought might have better domestic and economic policies. Wasn't true, but that's the psychology of the moment. The second reason, of course, is Ross Perot. Ross Perot comes in and takes 19% of the vote, 2/3 of which belong to Bush. Bush would have won without Ross Perot. But the third reason is a very interesting one, particularly in light of what's happening today. Since Dwight Eisenhower, no party has held the White House for more than 8 years, except once, and that's when George Herbert Walker Bush won and added 4 years to the Reagan 8 years. There's a tendency in this country when it comes to White House votes to have a pressure build up to clean house in the White House, so to speak. That's not, by the way, just a recent phenomenon. If you take away Roosevelt's four terms, four victories at the ballot box, driven primarily because the last two were during World War II, that goes back another 70 years that no party has held the White House for more than 8 years. So that's a natural tendency, and George Bush suffered for the combination of all those effects. I truly believe, and I hope you will come to the same conclusion when you read one of the 8 or 9 books you may buy. Remember, you have good friends. I truly believe that George Bush's 4 years was the finest single-term presidency. I think that he and Ronald Reagan together put 12 years together that were historic years for the world and for America. And I really do think that the quiet man, as the historians take a look back at the real impact that he had, will begin to understand that, like Ronald Reagan, the Bush presidency was a truly great, great American presidency. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. I will either take questions or go away quietly, whichever you prefer.
We'll take a few questions. If you could, if you have one, raise your hand. We have staff in the aisles who will bring to you a microphone so we can hear your question, but we're also, this is being filmed and it's live on the internet, so we'd like to be able to hear you as well. We have one right here, I think.
Governor, Marissa Coughlin. I had the pleasure, my husband had the pleasure of meeting you at President Reagan's inaugural. And I was just...
Are we all old?
I was much younger, anyway. But I was just wondering, how is it that the dignity and honor of the presidency, when you think of President Bush 41, how is it that he's able to maintain that honor and respect for the office where even some of the young people, they don't even know who the current president is?
Well, you know, every time I answer a question like that, I keep listening to myself and I say, you old fogey. The world has changed. It comes from the president, right? And we may have young people who may not pay attention enough, but if there is a president that is worth paying attention to, I think they'll pay more attention than they do. That doesn't mean that we will get 100% of their appreciation of what's happening in the White House, but it really requires somebody to do something in the White House that deserves their paying attention to. Yes,
Right over here. She's got a microphone for you.
As you know, Governor, we have 146 candidates on the Republican Party for president.
Yeah, and they're all in New Hampshire.
If the election were to take place right now, today, you know them all. Who's your choice?
I am avoiding endorsing this time around. I will tell you that my preference, because I feel the mess we have is so dramatic, my preference is a governor or a former governor who has dealt with a legislature, who has had to make executive branch decisions, who is not going to have to go through a learning process of how to run a bureaucracy and how to try and control a bureaucracy. So I lean towards a governor and a former governor, and we're lucky there's 4 or 5 of them running on the Republican side, and I could be happy with almost any one of them. It doesn't mean that I won't end up with a preference sometime, but I have too many good friends running, and I'm trying to avoid having to make a choice in public.
Thank you.
Another question? One right over here. Okay.
Governor, at the time, I had the impression that it was halfway through the campaign season before George Bush really made up his mind he wanted to run for re-election. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I left the White House in March of '92, and I had hoped that the lightning would follow me, and it didn't. It stayed there, and Ailes was gone. Ailes had gone to do what he ended up doing on the television, on the media side. Lee Atwater had died, and frankly, I just don't think it was a well-run campaign, and I think the president got frustrated to some extent. And as I say in my book, when he had that scene where he looked at his watch at the debate, I had a chill run through me, because not that I was able to predict what a negative impact it would have with all the news stories that would come out, but I understood from that, when I saw that he was really frustrated with the process, and really, in my opinion, had lost a lot of the energy that he should have for campaigning. I wasn't inside, but I can tell you, looking from the outside, I had similar feelings to what you said.
I think we have one right here.
2,000 years ago, Caesar was asked the secret of power, and he said circuses and bread. By circuses, he meant media, because they didn't have radio or TV, but they did have circuses. And he put on, see the gladiators free from Julius Caesar, and he had hired loads of guys to go down to the poor sections of Rome and throw loads of bread to the poor, brought to you by Julius Caesar. Well, the circuses, he was the first Democrat. And the Democrats have kind of really stole that. Is there any way for the Republicans to counter that circuses and bread?
Well, you know, I will tell you what we've allowed, in my opinion, those of us who think the other way, have allowed that to succeed, because we have a lot of our good friends who believe in the same kinds of policies we might believe in, who sometimes talk themselves out of the need to having to vote and give themselves a good excuse. And the classic example for me is in the last election. I'm told there's about 5 or 6 million people that chose not to vote because Mitt Romney was a Mormon. And look at where we are now, right? So we cannot allow the fact that we don't get our favorite nominated to keep us from doing the right thing at the ballot box. And if we don't, we're going to have a problem. There are 146 candidates, as the gentleman pointed out, in this election. And that means, statistically speaking, virtually all of us are not going to get our first choice, right? And so we better resign ourselves to the fact that we're not going to get our first choice, but that we ought to unite and deal with our second, third, or fourth choice in order to save the country. Otherwise, we do have the bread and circuses syndrome. We'll win once more.
Yeah, let's see. I'll come back here. One over here, and then we'll go back this way.
Governor, thank you for coming. Do you think the entrance of Joe Biden was President Obama's plan all along against Hillary?
You know, I have been saying for the last 3 or 4 months that if Mrs. Clinton continues to run a bad campaign, that someone, either Joe Biden or John Kerry, who was their nominee once before, would signal that they were available and that maybe the Democratic leadership would start oozing them in. So I don't think it's been a secret plan, but I don't think it's unlikely that might perhaps be the way it plays out if Mrs. Clinton doesn't get her act together. And I think she's demonstrating once again she is not a good candidate, she is not a good manager, and she certainly would not make a good president.
To the back.
Governor, I have a question about the 41's library. I've been to more than half of the presidential libraries, and the thing that struck me as extraordinary about the library in College Station is how integrated the material for children was throughout the library. And I was wondering if you happen to know whose idea that was. It probably wouldn't hurt a lot of presidential libraries to do that.
Yeah, I must admit I don't know who really was the architect of that idea. I've noticed that myself. I think what happens is each new presidential library builds on what they learn from the others and adds something. And so, you know, the further down the line you are, the more you're able to draw from the wisdom of others. And so I think it's a good idea that others go back and look at it, and as they go through the process of modernizing, because we have to keep up with the technology for presentation, they could take advantage of the point that you make.
We had another one right up here, here, and then we'll go here. Great, thanks.
Governor, I'd like to return to the Perot factor.
Yes.
Do you know if the president, President Bush, and Ross Perot ever buried the hatchet?
I think the only place the president would like to bury the hatchet. I don't think so. You know, the Perot factor was much more impactful than you know, you get these brilliant analysts in the press that say, well, no, it should have been 50-50. It was 2/3 Bush's vote, and every dollar Perot spent on the campaign was spent attacking George Bush. He never attacked Bill Clinton. The biggest mistake the Bush campaign made, if Lee Atwater had been there, he would have gone after Perot with a 2x4 and cut him down to size early, and they didn't. They really didn't. And they let him gain traction and come back and really mess up the election.
Right here.
Hi, Governor. I just want to tell you, I really enjoyed your speech. And where are the teleprompters? That's not really my question. I recognize that you have a tremendous amount of friends in this wonderful group of people that have high quality and could be president. But have you done enough research to find out who is the community organizer?
You know, it's an interesting thing that we have a generation out there that really doesn't value experience as a contributor to their selection process. And that's dangerous because it happens not only in this obvious situation you're alluding to, but it happens over and over and over again. We have reached a point where a significant number of our electorate is voting for style over substance. So let me leave you with one message that I think is important. You've got to go out and talk. You've got to communicate with people and let them understand how crucial that little X they put on that piece of paper and put in the ballot box is. Because a lot of them think it doesn't make any difference. And it really does, as we know. But it's up to us. We have to proselytize. So when you go home, read the book, and then go out and talk.
Great. On that note, thank you, Governor.
Thank you.